This computer. We're recording. Okay. I want to make sure. Y'all tell me. I've got something I'm gonna read. If we get over talk about the Bible on the husband and wife, I'm gonna read you some stuff that from two other books that I've got that's online in my Logos program. So I'm gonna switch over there, and I'm gonna ask you, can you still hear me? Now you may not see me, and I want you to tell me what you see. Okay, you ready?
Yep.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
What do you see?
You?
I see Bobby Gay.
Do you? Okay. Well, okay. Let me see here. If we get there, I'll switch over because it's some stuff that I bought, and it's pretty good. Also, brother Tib was here tonight, so he's doing a lot better. He said took a little time. He got that stomach virus real bad, and so we're glad that he's doing just fine. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll start. Eternal Father, we're thankful again for the day. We're thankful for thy continuous blessings upon us and the things that thou provides for us from day to day. Truly, thou has been good to us. There are many material blessings that we enjoy from day to day, but especially thankful to thee for the spiritual blessings that we have in Christ. We're thankful, Father, for the church and for being a member of it. We pray, Father, that we'll always strive to bring glory and honor unto thee as we worship thee and as we live for thee day by day. We pray, Father, for each congregation of thy people. We pray thy blessings upon us as congregations, that we'll work together for edifying and building up the church, and also to evangelize our world, to do those things that for people that are in need. Pray, Father, that we'll try and strive to have the same mind and same judgment on things, and that we'll strictly go by thy word and study thy word and hide thy word in our heart that we might not sin against thee. We're thankful for Jesus and for his love for us. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, we were talking about some of the things in reference to that of the basic morals. In Brother Ferguson's book, I noticed that he breaks them down. We were talking about the Greco-Roman, and in his book, he just simply points out morality, and I said in his book they break it down. In our book, they break it down that we're using, exploring the New Testament world. But in his book, he just puts it all together and deals with that of morality. And so he talks about the principles, and he says these principles explain some of the surprising turns in that of Roman politics. And so he's talking about those. He talks about when Caesar was assassinated, giving that as an example, how that they would actually deal with their wealth. You know, like when when my in-laws passed away, we received, my wife received their properties and so forth and so. But what he did, he left his wealth and power to his grandnephew, Octavian, and so this kind of surprised and angered that of the lieutenant, chief lieutenant of Caesar, and that was Mark Antony. And so, because he expected to actually, he wanted the position to be the next Caesar, and so he thought that's what was going to be. So he actually contested the legality of the will. And so it gives us some type of understanding how their system is something similar to ours. You know, you can contest the will, and that's what he did. And he had a deep animosity developed between him and Octavian, and yet they put their resentments aside long enough to defeat Caesar's assassin. And so Antonio, Antonio, he married Octavian's sister, and then they turned on one another. So at even one point, they did either man seem to consider what might be advantageous for that of Rome, and how that they might reach some permanent compromise. And so, so we look, today we see, we're divided, like even in our country, in reference to the different political parties and everything. Instead of they should be asking the question of what's best for all American people. Well, that's basically what he's saying here in reference to them. So there's no difference in some of those things that, we can stop for a moment and think what was going on among that of the Greek world, that they were actually, divided among themselves. The Romans talk about a lot about moral and upright behavior, and they used those terms as duty and loyalty and prudence and utility. And by the first century BC, they were lamenting the decline in morality, which they saw everywhere. And probably all of us we can identify with that, even in our country. And I sometimes are surprised about what goes on in other states. I don't travel like I used to. I'd go basically in the South. I traveled and preached in meetings and stuff like that, and did some work in Bible classes for other congregations and helping them set up things. But basically meetings and so on. And, you could see what was going on probably in those states. But some of the states that I had never been in, when you go to some of those places, you find out you see some of the decline in that of morality. I remember when I came back from Vietnam, that I got back September the 1st, 1968, been gone for a year from home. And I told my friends that were sitting there, there's about 6 of us, and we were sitting there, and all of us came from basically the same company. And so different platoons, but we knew one another in Fort Polk. But we went to the airport. We didn't stay there for their steak supper that they give all Vietnam veterans when they come back. We got our greens and all of our medals and all of our back pay and all of our travel pay. Make sure we got all that. And we just told them we didn't want to eat. We was going to get what we were trying to do. All of us were going to fly to Atlanta, and then we would depart from other places to go other places. Or 3 of us was. And so we got there and we had to wait because we missed the plane. And so I told myself, well, I'm going to go call my mother and them. I said, my fiance, which is my wife now, I said, she'll be there. I'm going to go call her. I went, and I had never, I was in California, San Francisco, Jim's country, Jim's state. He's from, his mother lives out there now. And so I went over there, and the telephone booth, you have to step down, and sit down. And I did, and I'm sitting there, and I'm dealing with the operator, and all of a sudden somebody walks by, and they look like they naked. And it was the young ladies in the clothing that they were wearing out there, and I just shook my head. I said, what in the world has happened in America while I'm gone? Because most of the women out there, they walked by, and you could see their underwear. So things change, and so that was their problem there. They had their morals, and yet we find that they were actually slipping away. And so they never defined any basis for teaching morality other than admiration for the virtues of the earlier generations. And so they were decidedly against interfering by means of legislation in the development of moral behavior. So since that first century, by the first century, that population of Rome was a polyglot of former slaves and people drawn by commercial opportunities. The city had no traditions that meant anything to the masses of the people. So you can just imagine, especially now in Rome, that Rome was the center of the world. It's like going to Atlanta. I can remember going to Atlanta, and we went to Grants Park and stuff like that. We played on the streets at night because my father lived there. My mother and father were divorced, and he lived right pretty close to Grants Park, worked at Fulton Bag Cotton Mills, and we played out in the street all the time. But you don't do that now, because the environment has changed. Well, that's what happens in reference to that of Rome. All this flow came to that of Rome, and so the immigrants brought in by this flood had literally been demoralized by uprootage from their native surroundings and their cultures and their moral codes. And, they had those. But again, you throw in all those together and years of slavery, and it destroyed in them their self-respect, which is the backbone of the upright conduct. Now, and daily friction with groups, different customs that had worn away still more of their deep custom-made morality. Now, you just stop and think about that and think about the church. That some of these people are going to obey the gospel, and then they're going to be thrown in the mix of some other people who came from other places, and then plus they're going to have them the Jewish brethren, Jewish who obey the gospel, and some of them, again, we've already looked at the Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and the Herodians and some of those other people, groups of people. And so all of them are thrown into the church. And so you can imagine, especially when you get over to the Corinthian letter and all the problems that they were having. They had problems with the hair and things of that sort, and even marriage problems. And so you throw all that together, and you can, if you could imagine say, for instance, if you went downtown Atlanta and said, I'm going to start a congregation downtown Atlanta here, and you went out, and all of a sudden you had these different people that come into Atlanta from different countries and different other states and stuff like that, and you bring all these brethren together, you're going to have some problems. And you have elders, it's going to take a lot of work on the elders' part to deal with some of those problems. And so if a people lack a morality base on customs and traditions, they might turn to religion for a grounding of their social behaviors. But the Romans did not see that morality had any relations to their religious beliefs. And so the object of religion was to secure the goodwill of the gods and avert misfortune. So in short, as one of the writers wrote, Roman religion was concerned with success and not with sin. And truly, if we were to read the Roman letter in Romans chapter 1, we would read there, beginning verse 18 down to verse 32, about the sins of the Gentile people. Then we turn to Romans chapter 2, and I always get this idea, and I think I've said this before, you get the idea that the Jews, somebody was in the congregation, as they was reading the letter to the congregation, they started chapter 1, verse 18. They weren't chapters and verses then, but chapter 1 and verse 18, and boy, the Jews sitting over there, and I guess their button's about to come off their chest, Then the Apostle Paul turns and says, oh, you're without excuse. And then he lights into that, guided by the Holy Spirit, to that of the Jewish brethren. And so they had their issues. And so blood, guilt incurred by murder, and didn't render a person unclean and unsuitable for participating in rituals, but a man could seduce his neighbor's wife on the way to a pagan god's temple, or cheat his neighbor in a business deal and still be acceptable to their deity, that is their gods. And so when you look at all those sins that are mentioned in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Romans, you can say, man, these people are terrible. But because they were from all different backgrounds. And so there were certain restrictions because of class or societal obligation, but no action in itself was immoral, except for incest and cannibalism and murder of a blood relative, and things that are taboo in almost every society. Anthropologists have studied that a pious person was one who would observe the proper rituals regardless of how he felt about them. And, there are laws that I don't like even in our country, and I obey them. I don't like them. I mean, I don't like paying income tax, which I don't have to pay much anymore, but, I paid a lot of Social Security. I had to pay the full amount because I was, let's see, a preacher has double something, I forget what they call it, but if the congregation pays the Social Security, you still have to count it as income. And so if you pay all of it, you get it as a deduction also. So you don't pay income tax on that amount of money. So that helps preachers in that sense. It helped me because in the sense that I was being paid very well where I was preaching there in Cartersville, and started paying a lot of income tax, and I didn't like that. So I had to work that out. But we would find that most Christians today would define their sexual morality as based on religious teaching. The Greeks and the Romans made no such connection. One fellow writes, he says the domains of religion and sexual morality were then regarded as completely separate. And so the Romans, now, again, we see, as we're studying this, because we're studying about the world of the New Testament, we have to make sure we understand that, because he's going to deal, even in the book of Romans, Romans 7, he deals with the Jewish people in Romans 7 in reference to that of the law that being married to someone else. So you can't be married to the Old Testament law and the law of Christ. That's his point there. He's not really dealing with marriage and divorce. He's actually just using an illustration. But when we get to the Corinthian letter, and also when we see what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 9, and also Mark and Luke, that when you put all of that together about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, we have to stop for a moment and remember, why is Paul dealing in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 with the way that he deals with marriage, divorce, and remarriage there, in reference to, even that a virgin's married and married because there's great persecution. We have to remember what these people had been taught all of their life. And it was contrary, among the Greek people, it was contrary to what the Bible said. And so there was a big problem. So they had this attitude towards sexual mores remained remarkably consistent over several years. Durant, and if you ever If you ever go into a bookstore or a Goodwill store and you find there's a set of books by Durant, and if they're selling them, you might want to buy those. I've heard a fellow, he bought them very cheap. I think it's about 10, 11 volumes of those, and he does some good writing. But Durant describes it. He says, from beginning to the end of the Roman history, the sexual morality of the common man remained essentially the same, coarse and free. What increases with civilization is not so much in morality of intent as opportunity of expression. And so given the proper circumstances, any Roman man would attempt to sleep with any woman, provided only that any potential retribution from her male kin might not be too severe. And so an incident that illustrates the point, Apuleius, in around 180 AD, the main character was a young man named Lucius, and he was staying with a friend of his family while visiting in a foreign city. And so the host's wife was extremely attractive, and Lucius thought she might receive his attention kindly, but he reflected that she was the wife of his host, and so it would be a violation of his obligation as a guest if he tried to seduce her. So it would also get him thrown out of the house if his host found out about it. So therefore he resolved not to seduce the wife, but tried to for the maid instead. And so being of a lower class, she was fair game. So the issue here is not whether it's right or wrong to have a sexual relationship with a woman he isn't married to, but which woman it would be more advantageous for that of Lucius to seduce. And so you find people today that basically do the same thing. And so such a passage shows us from the Greek Roman viewpoint how Jesus blanketed prohibiting his prohibition. Well, I can't say the word, but anyway, against adultery and against even desiring a woman, which had been virtually incomprehensible, as would most of his ethnical principles. You can turn over, and I don't have this highlighted. Let me highlight this passage right quick. I don't know how I missed that, but I did. And I missed it twice because I went back to see about Brother Ferguson's book. But if you turn over to Matthew chapter 5 in your New Testament and trying to remember now what we just said in reference to that of the Greco-Roman morality issues, and you look at what Jesus says here, and he makes the point, because again, if you remember what we just read about Lucius, in Matthew chapter 5 there, beginning in verse 27, he says, you have heard, and sometimes that's a good sermon, those of you who preach, you have heard, and also it is written. Those are two good sermons that a person can preach. He says, you have heard that it was said of them both times, thou shalt not commit adultery. So he carries them all the way back to Moses' time. He says, but I say unto you. So in other words, that's what we've said. You've heard that it said, or it was written, and then, this is what I say, what Jesus says. Whosoever looketh on a woman, notice the word looketh there is a continuous action. One who continues to look on a woman to lust after her have committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right hand offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members, he says, should perish, and not that whole body shall be cast into hell. And so we find that Jesus there just simply points out to us in reference to what you could do. You're not supposed to be lusting after somebody. Now, all of us understand that there are women who look at men and they're handsome men, or that they think they're handsome, just like maybe we look at a woman and that she's a nice looking lady and so forth. But, I had a friend request, I think it was today. Yeah, it was today. It might have been yesterday, but he answered me today. And he had a picture of a woman in a red tight dress, and she was bent over. And I just told him, I wrote him a message. I said, no, I will not friend you because of the immodest picture you have on your Facebook page. Well, you could tell he got kind of upset about that, and he wrote me back. Now he said, I don't have that kind of stuff on mine. I said, well, you go over there and look at that woman that you got a picture. Matter of fact, it's on there twice. because it was a running story about adultery, and so he gave some pictures, and I just told him, I said, you're gonna be one of my friends. Because if I look at somebody's picture and they have immodest pictures on them, I unfriend them. I don't friend them to begin with. But because of that, he says there, that we are not to lust after that of a woman. The same thing would be in reference to that of a woman lusting after that of man. But again, we have to remember what he just told, what we understand about Lucius is in the sense that, here's his host. He couldn't, but there's the maid, Well, Jesus says you can't look up on any woman. That's his point there. Whosoever looketh on a woman, so it'd be any woman. And so Lucius would be wrong in doing so, and so would we be. Also, the Apostle Paul had sounded like he was preaching a strange doctrine too when he was exhorting the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 10:24. He says, "Do not seek your own advantage, but that of others." So this is not to claim that no Greek or Roman ever thought about doing something for someone else, but such altruism was a rare sentiment. And so we would have to make sure we understand, and that's the whole point of our class, is to make sure we understand some of the morals that the Greeks and the Romans had in some of the background, so we can understand why is it that the Apostle Paul or the other apostles or the other writers, why is it that they are taking it from this view? And so in his Republic, Plato tried to refute the definition of justice as doing good to friends and evil to enemies. But you remember Jesus in Matthew 5 and verse 43, here he goes again. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, that's what they taught. But Jesus, he points out to them that you're supposed to love your enemy. And we'll find that Paul later will write in the book of Romans, when he writes them, he says that, that you be kind to people, heap coals of fire upon their head. So there are other Greek and Roman philosophers that express the altruistic sentiments similar to the Christian notion of loving the neighbor as ourselves. John Whitaker had shown, but the idea never seems to have gained wide popular acceptance. Seneca, the historian, advised it about the closest the Romans could come to a basis for morality that expressed pure concern for others. Treat your inferiors kindly because they give the whims of fate. Could someday be your superior. So self-interest and would be really at the very heart of that, the way you treat someone and so forth, that you would have to make, especially if they became your superior and you didn't have a run-in with them, you're going to have some problems. So they deal with that. And so, but we need to realize also the scriptures and how they teach us and our relationships to the outside world. But, most time we say, when you look at the book of Romans or the book of Revelation, no matter if it's written to the church or written to the individual, you're having the Godhead give Christians God's word. And those things are addressed to a Christian. But like one brother made the point, he says, well, would it be wrong for a non-Christian to live by the same rules? And the answer would be no. It'd be good that everybody live by those same rules that the Bible points out. But the world doesn't want to go by those. I listen. I don't know how y'all listen, but I listen to some of these people, and sometimes I'm listening to news on the radio as I drive from place to place, like going teaching at night and so forth. And they get in this thing, and especially just recently gotten all this Green Deal stuff, and I just laughed. I thought it was one of the funniest things I ever heard in my life. I got an advertisement to go to Jerusalem. When Jim pays it for me, it's $1,859. And, I would, but the thing is, if the green thing is true, if they were to start the green thing, how in the world am I going to get over there? Because you can't burn fossil fuel, so I can't fly. Can't burn fossil fuel, so I can't ship. But get a ship. I don't know, if they build a road, I'd have to have an electric car, and I don't know how do they make electricity? That's what got me. But not only that, I kept thinking to myself, I said, and we don't hear this on the news media, and I've never heard anybody bring it up on the news media, but Genesis 8:22 solves that problem of climate change. It just simply it's like God's in control. And he's going to destroy this world or let the world destroy itself. If that's the way God wants it to be destroyed. But people don't believe what the Bible teaches in Genesis 8, verse 22. So the evidence for Roman morality, if only 1 or 2 century writers displayed immoral or amoral attitudes. Now, when he talks about amoral attitudes, now government, people who work for government, they have to have an amoral attitude. Now, I worked for the veteran service, and I had to have an amoral attitude. The state of Georgia wanted to hire me as a parole officer, but my duties were going to be, because of my degree in counseling psychology, is that I was going to be the one who went to court, and when I went to court, I was the one that's going to testify against the person who violated his parole or probation. And so they asked me, did I have a problem with that? Well, I mean, the two people who was interviewing me, I said, no, I don't have any problem with capital punishment. I said, matter of fact, if they were to have 5 buttons out there and they want me to match one, I said, I have no problem with that. You know? And they didn't like it, but they offered me a job. But the thing of it is, I had to be amoral. And that's because of our government. You can't make a decision, you know, because, say, for instance, you know that it's wrong to be having sexual relationship with someone else, and somebody comes in your office and you're having to maybe deal with them with food stamps and things of that sort, or maybe veterans affairs and so forth. You can't judge them, you know. And so you just have to make sure you don't do that, because you get in big trouble. Well, that's the way they would. They displayed immoral. They're about the immoral or amoral attitudes, and we might argue that they were expressing their personal views and did not represent the society at large. But the same themes reappear in one writer after another when you go and look at the writings. And again, like I said, you can go down to Barnes Noble and you can get all the basic of those historians that wrote back in those days, and you can see some of that. But in the lives of one political figure after another, from the 1st century BC to the early 2nd BC, Catullus, he was 84 to 54 BC, was the first of the lyric poets to write about his affair with a married woman. And when he gave the pen name Lesbia, Proprietess was with his Cynthia, and Ovid with his Corinna, made this a proper model for the jet set of the day. Now, I grew up, and I tell my age, I guess I'm the oldest one that's listening. But when I came back from Vietnam, and I was married, and they had all this stuff going on in Atlanta down on 10th Street, the 10th, 11th, and 12th, and 13th Street, all in there, free love and all that kind of stuff, the park and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, that was the new morality. Well, when we look, as he talks about here, he says later in his life, after he had been exiled, Ovid tried to claim that Corinna was purely fictitious, and his life, if not in his poetry, had been pure. So at the end of the century, Marshall would make the same claim. And so, in other words, it worked for one, it may work for the other, you know. And so that's what they tried to do. There were other writers like Petronius, 2766 AD. So here we're actually talking about the time that Jesus began his ministry, around 27. And 66 is basically, if we go, probably the book of Revelation, because I believe it's all written before AD 70. The book of Revelation is probably one of the books not been written at this time. And then you had Juvenal, he died in 130 AD. They show us that the situations got steadily worse until the early 2nd century. And so we can only conclude that even allowing for literary exaggeration, that is, poets are allowed to lie. It's as Pliny would say, and it's sometimes we say that the poet can kind of, when we sing songs sometimes, well, that's the poet's advantage or whatever. He can do that to make it rhyme or whatever. But if it teaches an untruth, the poet can't do that. So the picture these writers present is true fundamentally, if not in very every detail. This corroborated by pictorial evidence from Pompeii and also Herculaneum, where today the guides will, for a fee, of course, remove the covers concealing certain obscene paintings and mosaics, if you're there. If you go and look at some of the things that are in Rome and other places, like the archaeologists have found and what they placed, we have found in some of the pictures in biblical archaeology that place we have on Fayetteville, some clothing and the way that some of them are dressed, and they're immodest. The Romans, who regularly encountered nudity in their baths and arenas and theaters seem to have been less impressed by it than the Greeks, who saw it having overtones of heroism, as in the gymnasium, the Greek word that means to exercise naked. And the Maccabees, first and second Maccabees, deal with that. There is in the book, or in your notes, you'll find the picture of the ruins of the Roman baths at Troas. So that would be around Acts 20. But the study of morality in the first century, it presents a problem in choosing the best method. It was kind of a sociological survey, but Jay Crook, in his notes, he says sociology depends on a measurement upon statistical techniques for discovering what most people mostly do. And so upon a measurable evidence. And notoriously, the ancient world very seldom provides such evidence, and only particularly statements of individuals' alleged facts. And one of the things that we found in some of the writings that people have done, and because we know what the Bible says, I mean, even they find the Dead Sea Scrolls and other things, the Babylonian Chronicle, and some other things where that can prove what the Bible says, that it's true, even though that those things are not inspired. But I mean, the Babylonian Chronicle and so forth, the Dead Sea Scrolls and everything are biblical books. But some of the other writings would show to us the morality of the people. The limitations should be borne in mind, but it shouldn't prevent us from making some observations that will be generally applicable. We can use evidence from both the Greek and the Roman sources, since the distinction between Greek and Rome has long since blurred. As noted earlier, we will break down our survey of the Greco-Roman morality under several headings. And so we're going to look at the condition of family life. Now, looking at since some of you have the book, Brother Ferguson's book, if you look in it, and you might notice, do I look brighter today than I usually look? Because I'm not using the desk because all my stuff falls off. But in his book on page 72 to 76, he actually helps in many ways. He has a Greek vase there from around the 5th century BC, and the vase depicts women making preparation for a wedding. And it's kind of interesting just to look at it, because we actually see things there that, we say it looks like an angel there with wings. And then on page 73, we find a fragment of sarcophagus with a scene of the Roman betrothal or wedding around 2nd century AD. And so how that they would go about being wed. And so some of the laws, he talks about the family unit could take various forms, but might include, in addition to husband, wife, and children, and their spouses, if married, were other relatives and slaves and sometimes free men and other clients. The family was the basic unit of society in all the cultures that provide the background for early Christianity, Brother Ferguson says. He says the family was united by common religious observance, as well as by economic interdependence. In Rome, the father, as head of the family, convened a family concilium, which might include close family advisors to deliberate and decide important cases. Greek law required that marriage be preceded by a betrothal agreement. A father's pledge of his daughter to a prospective bridegroom was formal, with witnesses on both sides and her dowry agreed upon. And then in Rome, by the end of the Republic, this betrothal became a looser system, an informed businessman arrangement in writing before a witness, which was easily renounced by either party and did not necessarily lead to marriage. The dowry was considered the daughter's share of the parents' estate. So under the Roman Republic, 3 forms of marriage brought a woman under the power, or the hands, as we would say, of her husband. It was that of a religious ceremony. And some people sometimes ask us as preachers, and when they want to get married, do we have to have a religious ceremony to be married? Well, the answer is no. Well, you're not required by law. And I remember I left the state of Georgia one time and moved to Alabama. I guess because I went across the river, they thought I was in Egypt, over in Alabama. That's what I usually say. And when I came back, they called me and told me that their daughter wanted to get married, and she wanted me to do the ceremony. They first said they wanted me to marry her, and I said, well, she's too young for me to marry because I'm already married anyway, but they all do the ceremony. And so I said, yeah, I did it. So when I got up here, she had a statement that I had to sign in front of a notary saying that I was, quote, ordained and that I can perform wedding ceremony. She wanted to make sure her daughter was married. I said, the state of Georgia doesn't have such laws, but I mean, I don't mind signing it, but so on. But that was just what she wanted to do. Well, they had a ceremony back then, and most solemn and elaborate form. Then there was, they call it something else, called iptio, and that means a sale of the woman to her husband. And then there was the usus, living together uninterruptedly in the man's house for 1 year. You became married. What we call a common law marriage, which are no longer recognized in the state of Georgia. That went away in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. There's no such thing as a common law marriage anymore. Now, I'll just give you an illustration. My niece, the only relative that, close relative that my wife has living, she's 37. She had surgery, and she had a blood clot that left the surgery and went into her heart. And she's laid in a hospital bed, and her and her boyfriend are not married. He'd been making all the decisions for her, and then the hospital found out that they weren't married, and they told him he wasn't making any decisions. So she needed something done, and they went ahead and done what they thought was best for the patient. And we didn't even ask him. And he was pitching the fit, and they said, "You're not married to her. You can't make any decision." So, common law marriage. And they are in Tennessee. I don't know all about Tennessee, but I do know in Georgia. But there was also marriage without manus, that is based on mutual consent. In this case, the woman remained a part of her father's family instead of entering the husband's. This became practically the only type of marriage under the empire. The digest Justinian attributes to the 3rd century jurist Modestus the following definition. He says, marriage is the union of a man and a woman, a partnership for life involving divine as well as human law. That's how he defined it. So the bride was prepared for the wedding by a bath and clad with the special garments. Now, I have seen, and I guess you've seen probably movies too, where they don't show everything, but the idea there is that this is what they would do. It was back many years ago when they would show those movies about Rome and Hercules and all that kind of stuff. The ceremony included the placing of crowns or wreaths on the heads of both the bride and the groom. Essentially, the wedding in Greece and Rome was the conducting of the bride in a torchlight procession to the bridegroom's house. This scene is the way a marriage is depicted on classical Greek basis. In the formal Roman marriage ceremony, the couple clasped their hands. Formulas of marriage was pronounced. The marriage contract was read before witness and signed by them. This scene, in which the goddess Juno appears between the couple to unite them, appears in the Roman representation of a wedding. So after this, the wedding meal, the bride was formally removed from the arms of her mother, escorted to her new home, and carried over the threshold. And as it is typical, Greek art focuses on the dramatic and the Roman art on the legal aspect of the wedding. And he goes on, now Jewish marriages. So now we understand the Greek, the Roman. Now the Jewish marriages, according to the sources of the rabbis, show many formal similarities to the Greek and Roman practices. The marriage was a contract between families. It was effected in 2 stages, the betrothal and the wedding proper. That is, the betrothal was acquisition of the bride, and the wedding proper, taking the bride into the husband's home. The betrothal had the legal force of marriage and could be broken only by divorce. It was, because in Matthew chapter 1, verses 18, 19, Joseph was going to put away Mary. It was accomplished by the bridegroom paying the bride price or a part of it or delivering a deed. The customary written contract included the husband's duties to his wife and the sum due in her in the event of a divorce or his death. The bridegroom moving into his father-in-law's house to live with the bride without further ceremony was also recognized but discouraged in the writings of the rabbis. The wedding ceremony was held under a canopy. The bride was prepared by bathing, anointing, and clothing with special adornments. She was then escorted from her father's house to the accompaniment of song and dance and musical instruments, and since usually in the evening, torchlight. The essential element of the wedding was the introduction of the bride into the groom's house, where the huppah, was set up. 7 blessings were pronounced on the couple, and the marriage contract was read, followed by the 7 days of festivity. Consent to live together constituted marriage in all societies, and the procreation of children was its explicit object. Marriage was registered in order to have to make the children legitimate. Girls were normally married young in their early teens. Men much later. Greek men in particular, about 30. Jewish men, however, were expected to marry at 18. Jewish religious teachers praised marriage, and it was considered the normal state of human life. Frequently was the saying, "He who has no wife lives without joy, blessing, or good." Okay? So, in Rome and Greece, by the 1st century, the marriage could be terminated by the woman. Now, in Rome and Greece, the marriage could be terminated by the woman as well by the man, unlike the situation in Jewish law, where the right of divorce belonged only to the husband. Okay? Now, that's the problem that we come up with in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And therefore, and Paul dealing with what's going on there, and the congregation being made up of both Jews and Gentiles, he has to deal in reference to that, about divorce and so forth. Because, again, the Jewish idea was that, hey, she's a woman, and she can't get a divorce. Well, that's not the law anymore. There's a new law, and that's Jesus' law. And so, any question or comment on that? I read a lot from his book here, and he goes on. I just glanced over about 2 of those pages, but he ends up on page 76 and so forth. And he talks about other things like homosexuality and therefore the laws and so on. But according to our book, Bell's book, he says it would be going too far to say, as one scholar once said, that the freedom enjoyed by Roman women led to the decline of morals in general and family life in particular. Literary works and other sources provide graphic evidence that this decline was caused by a number of factors. And it is sad but instructive lessons to see how far the Roman sense of the family was degraded over the centuries. Now, again, Gibbons wrote his book, The Rise and the Fall of the Roman Empire. And because of divorce and the destruction of the family, that's the reason why Rome fell, was one of the reasons why Rome failed. But the Romans had their concept of that of the family. The early Romans, even more than the Greeks, had an austere, upright view of family. Rome itself was seen as an extended family with its sacred hearth and flame, and maintained by virgin priestesses. It's female priest devoted to festa, that is the festival that was held in June 7th through the 15th, and the goddess of purity of the home. Each family was a religious unit with its own household gods and rituals. This is some of the same thing that the Catholics have. I had a rental house, which, like I said, I sold it, but I had Hispanics living in it, and they had their own little setup from Catholicism in the corner of their house around the Christmas time. But as well as being a group of people related by blood, so they were a household. Each family was a religious unit. So all the families of the city joined together in worshiping certain tribal gods, such as Jupiter and Juno. Within each family, the father, as priest and the patriarch, they had absolute control of the lives and affairs of his wife and children. So the law allowed him to inflict capital punishment on them or sell them into slavery. Though such things rarely happened, he arranged his children's marriage and planned his sons' careers. And then now he shows a Roman couple, a photo of a Roman couple there. Now, and I think that it's interesting when I looked at that, because you look at when I'm looking at the person on the right is the man and the person on the left is the woman, but her hair is, I think her hair is pulled back and it's like in a ponytail. If not, then she has about the same kind of hairdo as the husband. And so that's a question that came up also in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So this power continued to enforce as long as the father lived, regardless of the age of the children. Even after the sons were married and had families of their own, everything of theirs belonged to their father. Now, I don't know because I haven't studied. People come up when they look in for that of elders, 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, and 1 Peter 5. And they bring up this idea about children and, the father's control in their household and so forth. But according to what the Bible teaches in reference to that, is that when a man and a woman marry, they cleave to one another. They depart from the parents and they cleave to one another. And so they make their own household. Well, right here we find that in the Roman household, everything belonged to their father. Even after the sons were married and had families of their own, everything belonged to their father. A daughter did not completely escape his control either, unless that was made a condition of her marriage contract. In other words, they could have it written in the contract. And so we hear sometimes, as a preacher and as a teacher, we hear sometimes when we're getting ready to appoint elders, and we get in all the discussions and so forth, that people bring up all kinds of stuff in reference to that once the children leave the home and so forth. And so we have to explain all of that in doing so. And so here tells us where some of this idea comes from, that a father is still in control of the houses of their children even after they leave home. But the Bible says that they are to leave mother and father and cleave. In other words, you leave and cleave. And so that's what we're supposed to do. I had some of the best in-laws, and some people say outlaws, but mine were in-laws. They were great to me. Members of the church, but they were very encouraging to me when I decided that I wanted to go to school preaching, and even as I continued my education. And they were always see to it if our children were with them that they attended the church, and they would carry them. And so we really appreciated them for that. He says, in some circumstances, a married woman's father could interfere in her affairs and even break up her marriage if he thought it advisable. The woman was expected to practice domestic crafts, manage the slaves, and behave herself with the utmost propriety. Now, again, when we turn to 1 Timothy, when Paul writes to Timothy, he tells about the work of a woman. She's a keeper of the home. Well, this is the idea. But again, we have to look at the culture of that time in reference to her being the keeper of the home. What did that mean? Well, here, according to the Roman law, it allowed a man to, well, I'm about to read that. I don't read that yet. The woman was expected to practice domestic crafts, was to manage the slaves and behave herself with the utmost propriety. Well, let's just say, for the sake of saying something other in reference to that, just say, for instance, all of a sudden, there's no longer any slaves. Everybody's been freed. So this woman, she doesn't have all that responsibility anymore. Well, let's also say that she doesn't need to be making crafts, because now they have businesses that makes those, and people go there and they work and make those, and they sell them. And not only that, so on. So could she go and work for a manufacturing company making those crafts and still be a keeper at home, in other words, because they made crafts, they made their clothing and everything else. And so all of that comes up when you get to over there in Timothy, that a woman's supposed to be a keeper at home. And so early Roman law allowed a man, get this, to kill his wife if he caught her in adultery, or divorce her if he detected the taste of wine on her lips. Though harsh, this view of the family produced a stable society in which adultery, divorce, and juvenile delinquency were virtually non-existent. Well, can you imagine that a man could kill his wife? Now, what if you were to say, well, now, if a man can kill his wife, you make that true today, if he catches her in adultery or divorce her, if he's tasted the wine on her lips, what if we made it both ways, that a wife could do the very same thing? We wouldn't be having many divorces, But you can find. But now what happened? Now we see this now, that this is what the historians are telling us. This is the way that it was. And then in that, they had a stable society. Adultery, divorce, and juvenile delinquency was virtually non-existent. But what happened? According to Gibbons, the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire, we find that this didn't continue. Eventually, these things declined. And so our next point is the decline of the Roman family. And there are several factors that combine to undermine this foundation of Roman society. Now, again, we have to realize that Christians, that were brought up in the Roman society or the Gentile society or the Jewish society. They were taught all these different things. And so when the apostles, and let's just say the Godhead, when the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit gave us the Word of God, they gave God's Word. Well, God's Word was given, and it covered the sins that people would commit and how that they were supposed to live their lives so they could be faithful to God and that heaven would be their home. Therefore, a person had to submit to that. And sometimes that went contrary to everything they had been brought up on. Maybe we'll say on marriage, and divorce, and remarriage. Just use that because we're talking about that in marriage. And I mean, it'd be something that, again, if this man here, if we'll say the man becomes a Christian and the woman does not become a Christian, and all of a sudden she commits adultery, well, he has the right to put her away. But now, on the other hand, she comes home and she has the taste of wine on her lips. That's not a cause for divorce. And so that would, according to the Roman, if he was a Roman man, he said, well, I would have the right, according to Roman law, to put her away. Well, you're a Christian. You can't put her away just because she got the taste of wine on her lips. Now, and also, you have to remember the taste of wine on her lips wasn't 40 proof or 50 proof or 100 proof alcohol, because they didn't get up to about 13% alcohol. In other words, she was drinking fermented, as we would probably say, that of wine's what I would say that he's getting there. But there was a decline. There's a number of factors about that. Only in the retrospect did many Romans perceive the demoralizing effect of the inordinate wealth which they acquired through their conquest of the 2nd century BC. In the words of the historian Sallust, he says this, and now he was 87 to 35 BC. He says, to the men who had so easily endured toil and peril and anxiety and adversity, the leisure and the riches which are generally regarded as so desirable proved a burden and a curse. Growing the love of money. Now notice that, growing the love of money, what Paul deals with when he writes to Timothy. And the lust of power which followed it engendered every kind of evil. Variance destroyed honor, integrity, and every other virtue, and instead taught men to be proud and cruel, to neglect religion and hold nothing too sacred to say. Now, if you notice, and I've noticed this, that there are those people who would fit into those categories, and you find people that who claim to believe in God, who claim to be quote saved, and the stuff comes out of their mouth disproves that. But they think they're all right, and because they're powerful people and so on. So others believe that the source of decay to the Greek lifestyle, which many Romans came to admire and imitate at that time, a lifestyle which found no harm in prostitution and homosexuality. For example, we saw back in lesson 6, Cato, the elder, 234 to 149 BC, saw that Romans' fascination for Greek culture, especially that of philosophy, as detrimental to the old Roman virtues. In Cato's view, Socrates was not a brilliant thinker, but he was a turbulent windbag who did his best to tyrannize over his country by understanding its established customs and seducing his fellow citizens into holding opinions which were contrary to the laws. And so, but his insistence that Rome be purged from Greek influences, we would find that and return to the traditions of the elder made him a dinosaur in his own lifetime. Then you stop and think about when we were growing up, we looked upon our parents and some of the things that they taught, and all of a sudden we saw the loose morals that was taking place in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and now we're looking back and we're seeing the loose. They got looser, as we would say. They have gotten looser, or more loose, or however you want to say that, in the generation that's here now. And so it's amazing to me to try to set up Bible studies with folks, and as you're sitting there setting Bible studies with them, they even got 2 or 3 kids, and they're not even married. And, and I've had a couple that that way one time, and he was an unfaithful member of the church, and she wasn't a member of the church, and they were living together and started coming to church, and they were going to get married, and she wanted to study, and so in our study we found all this out, and that they had to separate. She wanted to obey the gospel, and they was going to have to separate. And so what they did, they says, look, we know we're going to have a wedding coming up in about a month or so, but she wants to obey the gospel. And she wants to do it now. So what we're going to do, we want to go ahead and get married. And then we'll just have a ceremony when all of our parents, both of our parents is, and all the family can come down and do that. So that's what they did. Because they knew what repentance meant because we taught them that. So people, that's what they would do. They would try to, in this day and time, we'll find people that way. But turning back to that of the traditions of the elders. And so one disputable factor in the decline of the Roman family was the civil wars of the first century, which left Rome bleeding and exhausted, according to Tacitus, who wrote 56, who lived 56 to 120. The effect of these wars on the family structure of Rome was catastrophic. Many of the women, especially among the higher level people, the aristocracy, were widows, and there were few eligible men left to replace their husbands, and soon sons and daughters left without fathers were technically free from anyone's control, much like emancipated slaves. And you stop just for a moment and you think about that, and you think about the Civil War, and in reference to the fighting between the North and the South. But not only that, but because of slavery, that even some of the men who had to leave and escape, had to leave their wives and their families, all this type of stuff was bad for the United States of America. Well, just think about what happened to Rome there. Augustus, 63 BC to 14 AD, the family structure of Rome had all been but evaporated. So now this is at the beginning. Again, if Jesus was born 4 BC, so we're looking at Jesus being close to 18 years old at this time. And many women, particularly the upper classes, were living their lives unhindered by male control. And we see a direct result of this shattered family structure was a decline in the birth rate. And once it became common for some people not to be married, others saw the advantage of that status. Many people made a conscious choice not to marry or have children. And as an astonishing number of family names vanished from the census rolls during the first century. According to Pliny the Elder, 23 to 79, as the last male member died without any heirs. And so he writes that he left no children. Pliny didn't, and nor did his nephew, an adopted son, the younger Pliny. And so since the younger Pliny was an only child, his death meant the end of 2 family lines. So his biological father as well as his adopted father. And so those stopped. Coupled with the high infant mortality rates, the Romans, in their inability to have children, thinned the ranks of the upper class drastically during the first century, according to Pliny, 23 to 79 AD. And in Greece, for a man who has lost 2 daughters in childbirth, and he writes, he says, not only one of his 3 children survived, left as the sole prop and stay of a family which had not so long ago had many members to support it. Then again, in our day and time, years ago, families were anywhere from, we'd say, 4 to 10 people. Sometimes more people, some people had more children than that. But now, in our day and time, I've heard young couples, they've had one couple just getting ready to have their second child. They don't have any more. And then another couple, they had 1, 2, this was their 3rd child, and he didn't want to have any more. And she says, well, it's my body. I still want to have more children. He says, 3's enough. And he wanted a son, and they have a 3rd little girl. So I don't know if that'll change now or not. But Augustus attempted to reverse this trend by allowing only men who were married and the fathers of 3 children to hold political office and also the inherit property. So his legislation produced little more than marriages in name only, and a willingness on the part of the Roman aristocrats not to inquire too closely into the paternity of children born to their wives. He soon had to begin granting exemptions to these rulers, or there would have been no one eligible to fulfill important government office. So, Okay, any questions? Well, if there's no questions, I must have done pretty good on it. That's what I always tell them. Okay, it's 7:30, so we'll take a 10-minute break. You may not need it, but I do. All right, take 10 minutes. Oh, y'all back? Okay. Jim probably eating grapes somewhere. He's, y'all weren't on a while ago, Steve and Rita were, when I was talking about y'all hear me talking about him retiring? He's been 24 years in the Army.
Yeah, he's in here.
I hear it.
You hear him? And he's a ROTC fellow. He's a great fellow. He's helped a lot of young kids. So we appreciate him at Cartersville very much. His wife found out that she was 29 on her DNA. She was 29% Chinese and 23% Hispanic. So we have to bow to her. We bow to her because he tells she got Chinese royalty. She's from Panama. Great lady. Okay, about marriage. Now, I read some of the things that Brother Ferguson said, and so now we're going to look at what Mr. Bell says also, because we have in the book advice to newlyweds. A lot of people like to give advice, you know. I do marital counseling, and when I do marital counseling, basically I ask the couple, I said, I want you to leave tonight, and the next time you come, I want you to give me one word that will make your marriage successful. Well, you get all kinds of words, but the word I was looking for was commitment, because my wife and I have been married 50 years, and people ask us, not members of the church, but well, some of them do too, but people outside the church will ask, well, how'd y'all stay married for so long? And we used the word commitment. We were committed to our marriage. And, I mean, she's not as perfect as I am, but that's beside the point. I'll tell her that. No, she's a great lady. I don't see her. I see you, Rita. She's a great lady. I wouldn't be where I am hadn't been for my wife. What they say that behind every good person or good man is a great woman, and that's true in my case. Most people, when they get to know my wife, they say, "You married up." She married up. That means if I married up, that means she married down. Okay, marriage. Let me talk about marriage. Okay, the foundation of the family in Rome has anywhere. As we read and we study the Bible, and we see this is the bond between a man and a woman. But to understand the Roman concept of marriage, we must make a clean break with all the Christian notions of marriage. And this is very hard for us as preachers, not only as preachers, but as we teach people the gospel. It's hard because to the Romans, marriage was not sacramental. It wasn't a holy matrimony. It was not thought to be maintained or sanctioned by anything beyond the will of those who were parties to it, or their heads of their families. That was it. And so no one asked whether the bride and groom loved each other. And in most cases, they had not met before the marriage, or had only been introduced in the presence of their families. Mary's marriage to Joseph would have been arranged in this matter. It was certainly not unknown for a husband and wife to develop genuine affections for each other. But there was a bonus, not the foundation of the relationship. The basis for the relationship was the husband's domination. And so here's a writing that, let me go down here, Plutarch wrote on marriage, and this is what he wrote. I thought it was pretty good. He says, a good wife ought to be most visible when with her husband. When he is not there, she should stay home and keep to herself. When two musical instruments play together, it is the deeper tone which carries the melody. In a well-ordered household, every activity will be carried out by the husband and wife together, but it will be clear that the husband is the leading and making decisions. A mixture of wine and water is called wine, even if the greater portion of it is water. In the same way, a couple's property should be called the husband's, even if the wife has contributed the larger share. Don't make a marriage on the basis of physical beauty or how much money your wife will bring you. Instead, consider what she will be like to live with. To live with. The man who aspires to what is good and honorable will inspire his wife to become a woman of good sense and high principles. Sensible women will keep quiet when their husbands are angry and shouted. When their husbands are silent, they will comfort them with soothing words. Husbands and wives should try to avoid quarreling under any circumstances. but especially when they are in bed, it's not easy to escape harsh words and disagreements which may arise there. That's what Pluto wrote, and he lived in 46 to 120 AD. I think I'm going to put that in the bulletin. You know. You like that? Did y'all like that? No. Oh, there were, as we said earlier, there were 7 types of marriages in Rome, depending on the degree of power over the bride, which was granted to the husband. None of them required a ceremony to make them official. Those ceremonies were always held because the Roman liked an excuse to party. As much as anyone else, they want to party. So the least formal type of Roman marriage amounted to a little more than being like concubines. I remember somebody, a woman I'd known, and her husband had died, and this man's wife had died, and they were dating, and all of a sudden they wanted to get married. So they called me and said, "Will you marry us?" And I said, they asked me, where I was at, and I said, "I'm at the church." But they said, "Well, will you marry us?" And I said, "Well, yes." I said, "I'll do the ceremony." I said, "I need to go home and change." They said, "Oh, that's all right." Well, I had tennis shoes, blue jeans, and a T-shirt on. They said, "We just want a ceremony," said. "We got the marriage license and everything. We want a ceremony," said, "and we want to get married right now." And they came up there, they were dressed worse than I was. And these people that was they were well off financially. And so I did the ceremony. The problem that I had with the whole thing was it seemed like the daughter of the father, the daughter of the man wasn't happy that her daddy was getting married so quickly. Okay, marriage as a contract. Again, there were across the Roman Empire, marriages were arranged, as we said earlier, by the fathers, and that continued to the late 2nd century, according to Pliny. The bride's consent was not essential. Few marriages were arranged without it, because she came from a place where different household gods were worshipped. And again, we have to stop and think about that. The bride was regarded as an alien who had to be introduced to her husband's household gods, so they would not attack her as an intruder. Genesis 31:19. This notion is as old as Ruth's promise. You remember, Daniel, your God shall be my God. That's the idea. The bride brought to the marriage 2 things: her dowry and her virginity. Husbands were permitted to invest their wives' dowries or in case of property, to use it as they see fit. In case of divorce, however, the dowry was returned to the wife. Even if the wife had been found guilty of adultery, the husband could keep only a portion of her dowry. And so the chastity of unmarried women in the Greco-Roman world was really a major concern. Pliny, again, who was writing in 2379 AD, the father tried to ensure that his daughter's virginity, so that when it came time to arrange a marriage for her, she would not be damaged goods. And so a woman who had engaged in sexual relationship before marriage, whether willingly or not, was deemed to bear a permanent defilement that disqualified her from being a mother. So among the lower classes, this stigma mattered little, but it was primary concern among the higher classes. And so this attitude helps explain why upper class men could have extramarital relationships with lower class women without society's disapproval. And so in order to ensure their virginity at the time of the wedding, some girls were betrothed even before they reached puberty and began to live in their father's husband's home at the age of 10 or 11. Imagine. There is evidences that some suggest some Roman men consummated the relationship regardless of the girl's age. And so one of the most extreme cases is found in an inscription, which reads in part, "My husband, whom, Alice, I now have left, was truly like a father to me. When I was 7 years old, he embraced me. Now I am 40 in the power of death." In all ancient societies, except the city of Sparta, girls typically married at the onset of purity as soon as their bodies were ready to bear children. Now, in Epictetus, words. He says, starting at 14 years of age, girls are addressed by men as ladies. This meant that a first-time bride older than 15 was a rarity. And we should envision Jesus' mother Mary as being that age. And so a 13-year-old, a girl of 13, which were halted by her sudden death. There's plenty of writes about that. But you stop and think about that, and I remembered, I don't know if y'all saw this or not, but one time I was turning my TV, and there was a movie about Mormons. And there's this young girl, and she, had started her monthly period, and that word got around, and the man who she was promised to saw her kind of flirting around with a boy of her same age. Now, this was in the movie. And he went and told the parents it's time for her to come to him. And he was an older man, and I don't know how many wives he had, because they were showing polygamy is what they were doing. But he took that young girl, and my understanding was it was based on true stories. But you can just imagine, and here it was, some of that same type of thing was taking place among the other Romans, that they would get married at such a young age. The Roman groom was typically under 25 at the time of his first marriage, a 25-year-old marrying a 12, 13-year-old. It was not unusual for Greek and Jewish men to be closer to 30. And so you had the brides were often so much younger than their husbands. The number of young widows in the Roman Empire was higher than the actuarial tables would predict, because no mention of Joseph is being made after Jesus was 12, and more scholars conclude that he died before Jesus began his ministry. And so we know from inscriptions that many young widows married again. If they had demonstrated their fertility by having a child, they would be highly prized by potential husbands. And we find some of that deals with that, in the Bible, because he deals with marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And the Bible points out to us, if your partner dies, then you can remarry only in the Lord. And there's a big discussion about what that means. It seems to me that it means the only in the Lord means that you marry according to the instructions that God has given. In other words, you have the right to marry. The person you marry has the right to marry. Also, we find that there is in the book, Pliny writes this. He says, I write this to you. It's the death of a child bride. I write this to you in the greatest grief. The younger daughter of our friend Fundanus has died. I never known a girl brighter, more lovable. She deserved not just a long life, but immortality. She hasn't reached her 14th birthday, and yet she possessed the prudence and seriousness of a mature woman, along with the sweetness and modesty of a young girl. How she would cling to her father's neck, how she would embrace us as friends with love and modesty, how she loved her nurses and her tutors because of the service each gave her, how eagerly and intelligently she read her lessons, with what modesty and restraint she enjoyed herself, with what patience and courage she bore in her last illness. She obeyed her doctors, encouraged her sisters and fathers, and sustained herself by her own strength and mind, even after her bodily strength had given out. This willpower lasted right up to the end, unbroken by either the length of the illness or fear of death. Thus she had left us more and weightier reasons for longing and grief. Oh, what a profoundly sad and bitter death. At the time of her death was worse than the death itself. She was already engaged to an outstanding young man. The wedding day had been chosen. Everyone invited. So much joy now turned into such sorrow. I can't find the words to tell you what a wound I felt in my heart when I heard that Fundanus himself ordering that the money, instead of for a wedding gown and jewels, be spent on incense, funeral ointments, and spices. And so, 13 years old. Greek, Roman, I don't know, I don't ask because I don't have children, and but I don't know what age boys and girls date this day and time, even if they date. I think a lot of them just go around and do things together, and then, and so on. But they probably got an age that they date. We always told our children that they couldn't date till they were 16, our girls and our boys too. There's no distinction between if they're a boy or a girl. Greco-Roman marriages were contracts between families, not romantic attachments. Now, we say that, but there were times there were romantic attachments. The tender feelings Pliny expressed in several letters to his teenage wife are so exceptional in antiquity that Sherwin White describes him as the first man known to have written a love letter to his own wife. Paul's admonition, Ephesians 5:25, if you'll notice that he tells us that we're to love our wives as we love ourselves. And every time I think about that, and I'll show my age, I guess, there used to be a commercial with the men's razor aftershave, and the fellow slaps his face, like that, says, "Thanks, I needed that." And every time I think about, you're supposed to love your wife, there's nobody that's got all their faculties about them is going to sit and look in a mirror and beat themselves up. So why would they want to beat up a woman? Or on the other hand, why would a woman want to beat up a man? But they were supposed to love their wives, may not have been meant, therefore, in quite the emotional sense which we really usually give it on the basis of our experience. In Rome, that sort of sentiment was reserved for one's mistress. But the Christian view of marriage was based on a radical different understanding of a relationship between a husband and a wife. And that might help us to understand, again, Ephesians 5, and there are other passages that deal with the relationship of the husband and wife. Then there was divorce and remarriage, and this has been a problem, and it has been a problem for many, many years. It was a problem after the patriarchal age that Moses, if you go back to Matthew 19, we find that Jesus says, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, said they could have a right of divorcement, but that wasn't so from the beginning. God intended that when man and woman got married, that they stay married unto death. One of us were to die, then they could remarry someone who was eligible to marry. But since marriage with little more than an agreement to cohabitate, divorce was easy in the Roman times. And so in the less formal types of Roman marriage, it could be initiated by either partner, simply expressing publicly the intentions to cancel the arrangement. But the reasons for divorce varied from the trivial to the compelling. Even under that of the Roman law, women were forbidden to drink wine because it was thought to have absorptive properties. And again, like I said earlier, that you have to make sure that we understand that wine back then didn't get to about 13% alcohol. A man who found his wife drinking could divorce her on the grounds that she was endangering the ability to perform her primary function, and that was childbearing. So that's the reason why. But this provision was generally ignored by the New Testament times, as wine was commonly drunk at meals. And if one of the partners simply found someone else more interesting or another marriage more advantageous, that could be a reason for divorce. And so the most frequently mentioned cause, though, for divorce is adultery. Even if there was no love in our sense between husband and wife, fidelity was expected on the part of the woman if only to fulfill a condition of the contract. The wife who engaged in adultery was not only violating the contract, she was also disqualifying herself of becoming a fit mother. And so once that happened, divorce was a natural consequence, since a man was supposed to have a wife in order to bear that of children. So the early Romans, their law required that a man who caught his wife in the act of adultery to divorce her. He required, okay? It was a requirement. And so the most stringent version of the law required them to kill her. If the roles were reversed, she was not allowed to lay a hand on the man. Imperial times, infidelity of either party was regarded more lightly, and if the man tried to make an issue of it, he was often ridiculed as being unable to manage his own household. If the historians of Rome can be believed, divorce was unknown in Rome until the 3rd century BC. So we're talking about 200, 3rd century, will be coming down, yeah. So this does not mean that the Romans were any more virtuous in their early period of their history. It's just that social pressure as a closely knit community held marriages together. I was in the lawyer's office today selling my rental house, and the lawyer and the man buying my house, I know the lawyer too, but he knows him better than I do, and they have friends, and one of them asked the other one, did so-and-so get a divorce? He had heard that they got a divorce, and the other one says, I don't know. And so they were talking about that. But we find that these social pressures, and so even exposure to the Greeks and the increase in wealth would also break the old bonds. And so this gradual erosion of marriage is a pattern repeated in many cultures. Like we have in our culture now, we have just about everybody, every state has some kind of lottery, or they're connected to the big lottery and so forth. And a lot of those people, once they win the lottery, they not long after they win, within a few years, they're broke. And not only that, but their marriages are in trouble. As Jesus said, Moses allowed divorce as a way of dealing with human weakness. But then he makes that point in Matthew 19:8. He says, "But from the beginning, it was not so. That wasn't God's intention." And when I do counseling, I try to make sure that the people that I'm counseling, that I'm going to do the ceremony for, that they understand what the Bible said. And a lot of times I get myself in trouble because I ask, "Do you understand that the only cause for to bring this marriage to an end is if one of you were to commit adultery?" That gets you in trouble sometimes, especially when you got, 4 sets of parents sitting there. It gets you in kind of trouble. But the point of it is, you want the couple that's getting married to understand, this is a commitment for life. You're committing your life. And I remember one time that someone says, that it was a commitment to life, and they would encourage everybody, tell the young ladies now, if you want to know what your husband's going to look at, go look at his daddy. And the husband, the future husband, says, now if you want to know what your wife's going to look at, go look at her mother. And so you could do that, and that's who you're going to be living with. In other words, you're going to grow old together. And sometimes, because my wife and I have been married for 50 years, we have people say, "Y'all haven't changed a bit." And, I want to say, well, you need to have your eyes checked, because we have changed. But it is a commitment. So once made acceptable, divorce and remarriage became rampant. And that's happened in the United States. Even the slightest suspicion of impropriety on the wife's part was cause to end the marriage. Caesar, Julius, he learned that his wife had attended a religious rite which had degenerated into an orgy. So he divorced her, saying that Caesar's wife must be above reproach. Plutarch said that. He himself, on the other hand, had the reputation of being every woman's husband and every man's wife. So not very subtle hint at his bisexual, and revealing insight into the double standards and sexual morality which prevailed at that time. In other words, he was having homosexual relationships. Virtually every notable Roman of the 2 centuries on either side of Christ's birth was divorced and remarried at least once, and often to women also previously married. Cicero divorced his wife after a difficult 30-year marriage. He married a much younger woman, then almost immediately divorced her. Antonio also divorced from his first wife, married Augustus's sister to cement the political alliance between the 2 men, but divorced her to enjoy Cleopatra's company. So, just back and forth. We think Hollywood's bad, but the 1st century BC, Martial, 38 to 103 AD, can point to men and women married 6 or 7 times. I have a friend of mine. He's been married 5 times. He can't be married again in the state of Georgia. As a matter of fact, he married his last wife twice. And Juvenal chided one woman for having 8 husbands in 5 autumns. In such cases may be extreme, but even Pliny, who moved in more conservative circles, was married 3 times, the last at age 42 to a girl 16. So long, happy marriages were rare enough that Pliny could only occasionally point to one as an example. And stepmothers, a common phenomenon because of the prevalence of remarriage, gained a distinctly bad press in the city of Rome. Some of it could have been merited, maybe that's where they come up with that song, Mother-in-Law. If a second wife had children, it was in her and their interest to get as much of the father's inheritance as possible, even if this meant eliminating children from an early marriage. Now you know why they killed one another. There is a picture in the book that shows a wedding scene from a Roman altar. It's kind of interesting. I made it a little small there, but if you have to get the book, you'll see it in a bigger sense. But to retain some historical objectivity, we should stop to remind ourselves that the writers who are our main source of our study among the highest circles of the Roman society and the lifestyle they describe cannot be taken as normative for everyone. There were people, even though that we read all this bad stuff, there were people who lived right and tried to do what was right. There were those who, because this writing was taken before that of the times that of Christ, there were those people who were living according to what Moses' law said. And there were, that would be among the Jewish people, and yet even among the Gentile people, there are those people who actually were just married one time. And so we would find that among the lower classes, to judge from some of the inscriptions on tombstones, there was a more stable life, was not so rare. There's an epitaph from Rome that can serve as an example. It says there, talks to the person, this man had this written to his wife. It's to Sararella Fortuna, I'm going to get this right, to Nata, dearest wife, with whom he lived 40 years without the slightest cause of complaint. Marcus Antonius Incopas built this. Now, that's, a great tribute to his wife, 40 years. But even among that of the lower class, the frequency of marriage was declining in the first century, and divorce was becoming more common. Troilus, he wrote again, he's the one that wrote between 2766 AD, pictures of lower class morals is anywhere near accurate. Extramarital affairs and may have been almost as common as the masses as among the upper level of class of people. We do have a number of lead tablets and papyri, which with magical incantations placing curses on the owners, enemies, and unfaithful husbands and wives figure large in the sample. And so you can find those things. And so it was a terrible time. But also there was the infidelity in marriage. While divorce was not difficult, it was often not expedient, because most marriages had been contracted again by the husband, because the husband stood to gain something from his alliance with the wife's family. It sometimes happened that the husband invested the wife's dowry for her, then lost some of it. He could not divorce her because he could not return her dowry. So he had to stay with her. For these and other reasons, many husband and wife found themselves locked together in a loveless, formal marriage, and they often looked elsewhere for their emotional gratifications, and so they go find somebody else. And so they had these extramarital affairs, and the only prohibition that applied was that against violating another person's property, or at least against getting caught at it. And so there was infidelity in the marriage. The Greek orator Demosthenes, I think is what you say his name, 384, 322 BC, has summed up the classical male's view of extramarital arrangements in his prescription that men should have mistresses for our enjoyment, concubines to serve our person, and wives for the bearing of legitimate offspring. And the Romans' casual attitude toward such matters is exemplified by Livy's description of a young aristocrat whose affair with a free woman was not as all harmful either to the young man's financial resources or his reputation. So by the 1st century BC, the adultery was so common in Rome that Catullus could publish poems about his affairs with Lesbia, as we talked about before. And so we talked about that, or made a point of that. And so I'm not going to go through that again, but his advice, Ovid's advice, he made this statement. He said, easy things nobody wants, but what is forbidden is tempting. So the same game was still being played in Marshall's day. Epictetus, he wrote this. He says a Stoic on adultery, and he was a Stoic. He says, if we ignore the fidelity which is innate in us and seduce our neighbor's wife, what are we actually doing but destroying and ruining? Whom or what are we destroying? Human faithfulness, honor, and decency of behavior? Are not women by nature common property? You may say, yes, just a food placed on the table is common to all invited guests. But once it has been portioned out, should you snitch the share of the person next to you or stretch out your hand and dip your fingers in someone else's meat sauce and lick them? A finer dinner companion you'd be. Likewise, the theater is shared by all citizens, but once the seats are all taken, would you dare to come along and turn any man out of his place? In a certain sense, then, women are common property by nature, but when they have been distributed by law, you, like anyone else, must be content with your share and must not steal or taste what belongs to someone else. They got a pretty good point. So some husbands even help their wives engage in affairs, apparently hoping to gain leverage with the wives' lovers. And the most notorious example of such a thing was the Praetorian commander Macro, whose wife had an affair with the emperor-to-be Caligula in 1241 AD, according to Suetonius. And Caligula, however, eventually ordered Macro to commit suicide. I said he ordered. That's why when he ordered it, he had to do it or somebody would do it for him. So this was not a foolproof route to success, but that's what they would do. Then also there was prostitution and sexual abuse with that of slaves. And so in societies which place so little value on marital fidelity, we shouldn't be surprised to find prostitution flourish. Indeed, it has from an early era in both Greece and also in Rome. We find as we read the New Testament over and over again that this idea of prostitution, being that of fornication, that it is condemned by that of God. The Greeks openly encouraged prostitution, and many prostitutes became famous, especially in the 5th century of Athens. There's Pericles, who governed the city from 462 to 429, left his wife and lived with a Corsican named Aspasia, a well-educated, witted woman who attracted even men like Socrates and playwright Euripides and to the dinners and so forth conversations, and were filled with evenings in her house. And so it was a house of prostitution. And even long before the New Testament times, the city of Corinth had been famous for having some of the most uninhabited prostitutes in Greece, and even contributed its name to the Greek verb. And to practice fornication is what the Greek word means. That Paul's, when he writes there, the strictures given regarding that of women in 1 Corinthians 11 should be read against that background, realizing that, yes, those people there were actually practicing that of fornication, and probably not as universal prohibition. The behavior of the women in public was a particular problem in Corinth. And so especially among the class of people where Christianity was strongest, and Paul was attempting to cope with that problem at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now the Romans never officially permitted prostitutes to practice openly as the Greeks did, and never accorded them the status that the Greeks gave them. Yet Livy, he writes, and again, around 17 AD when he died, he acknowledging that the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, have been raised by such a woman. The Romans, he explains, used the word wolf, much as modern Americans use the word for a female dog. I don't use that type of language, so I don't, even when I see it, I don't want to read it. They use the word, he uses the word in the book to describe a woman of low moral character. We hear people today, they'll call people those names also. The story had been tidied up over the years, but its origin was undeniable. There are enough provisions in Roman law, including taxes imposed on brothels and enough references to prostitution in literature to assure us that such women were readily available. The graffiti in Pompeii's are replete with the names of such women, their specialties, sometimes illustrated, and also their fees were illustrated. Now, when Catullus' affair was with Clodagh went sour, he accused her of offering herself to men by the hundreds on the street corner. And so the fact that he could draw such an ugly picture of his former mistress suggests the presence of prostitution in large numbers in reference to Rome. And so as they would recognize that by him talking about his mistress. And Marshall says that both male and female prostitutes worked in portable booths on the sidewalk. And so the phenomenon of prostitution was an example empire-wide, as we can gauge from the references that Jesus makes in Matthew 21, verse 31, and also Paul's condemnation in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, because the fornication was taking place. And so the most famous, hear me out when I say this now, because I'm just telling you what Mr. Bell says, but I want you to hear me out. Most famous prostitute in the New Testament is Mary Magdalene, except that she was almost certainly wasn't a prostitute. She wasn't a prostitute, period. There are, I think there have been movies made and pointed out that she was a prostitute, but we don't know that she was a prostitute. The creative tendency of early Christians to explain or expand the backgrounds of minor characters in the New Testament led them to link Mary with the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, or the sinner who anointed Jesus' feet with her tears and dried them with her hair, Luke chapter 7, verse 36. Now, the feminist scholars, they insisted on a reevaluation of her reputation. She is, after all, listed first among the women who came to Jesus' tomb on Easter morning in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and in John's gospel appears first to her alone. And so the existence of prostitution in the Greek-Roman society is a degree to which the Greeks and the Romans tolerated and even encouraged. But yet this is the background of what we have to look at when we study the Bible on that subject. Today, we cannot open a newspaper or magazine without seeing another frightening article about AIDS and herpes and some other sexual transmitted disease or a rape or that type of thing. And it may occur to us to ask how promiscuous Greeks and Romans avoided or dealt with such things. And the answer is that they didn't have to worry about it. There were no sexual transmitted disease such as syphilis and gonorrhea in the ancient world. The first documented case of syphilis appeared in Europe in 1494. Columbus and his crew took smallpox to the New World and brought back this plague. This is antiquity. A man could have affairs or visit prostitutes without concern about contracting such disease. The Roman men, however, did not consort with prostitutes or go to all the trouble of seducing them. Instead, they forced themselves on their female slaves. And you can see this also during slavery times in the United States. These women were in particularly unfortunate situations, and refusal could result in punishment from that of the master as a prelude to that of sexual attack. Then if the lady of the house discovered what was going on, she was also likely to punish the slave woman, so she couldn't take her anger out on her husband, because that's against the law. So she would take her anger out upon that of the slave woman. Now, if you ever study that of slavery, or you go back and look, and you can find, I always used to tell people that the Gatons were so poor that that's because we were poor, that they didn't have slaves. Well, when I began to read about my family, because I found a book nearly 1,000 pages long about my family when they came to this country in 1675, 25 or 75, I can't remember the exact date. And somewhere along the line, they owned slaves. And there was one of them, he was very attracted to that of the slave women. And he had children by them. And in my lifetime, I tried to find the descendants of that child. and did have one of the children, one of the descendants of that child. I think she was. She called me, began to ask me all kinds of questions about people being buried in certain cemetery, and I said, yes, that's some of my descendants, and so forth. And so that happened, and we need to recognize that happened. It wasn't right during the Romans' time. It wasn't right in the United States' time. The frequent reference in laws to children born of slave women and free men suggests that such liaisons were common. Most of the Roman aristocrats probably had an illegitimate child or two tucked away on their estate. So those who made no secret of the situation were the butt of jokes, according to Marshall. And so it sometimes happens with Marshall, though, is that he has been laughing at something of which he himself was guilty. And so sometimes he writes about those things. What we can seldom determine is the willingness of a slave woman involved, but there was no double standard in the matter. By the first century BC, many women were engaged in affairs with also male slaves. And that was also common in the United States when during the 1800s. Any questions or comments? I have 8:21, and our next point is children and education. And I'm going to stop. Next week's what? 28? Is that right? That's right. Next week's the 28th.
Yes.
Let me
Yes.
put my little blue marker. That's too blue. Well, we'll make it some color. Oh, there it goes. Can't get my blue. Okay. Come on. I have to get a dark blue. I can't see. Okay. Still not doing it. There it is. I'm colorblind. I went to the VA today and they says, the nurse says, the man at the counter says, get one of them pink slips over there. And I said, somebody have to show me one because I'm colorblind.
Yep.
Okay, I'm just going to stop. Any questions or comments?
None.
Again, we're in the book, and like I said, if we get to, we finish the book before our time's up, because we have, in this class, we go May,
10th, I think, or something.
let's see, 21, 28, 7 and 28, 35, the 4th, April the 4th, 11th, the 18th, 25th, 7 on 25 is 32, April has 30 days in it, so
May 9th is the last one.
the 9th, May the 9th, I think is right.
Yep.
And so if we get through with this book, we're going to deal with some things that he doesn't deal with from Brother Ferguson's book. Okay?
Okay.
Y'all have a good night. Don't let the bed bugs bite. That's what I tell my.
Thank you, Bobby. Be careful going home.
I got a redheaded daughter, and I have one redheaded grandchild. But when she was little, that's what I used to say. You know, good night. Don't let the bed bugs bite. There ain't no bugs on me. And she said, ain't no bugs on me either, Papa. She lived with us. We nearly raised her. All right, y'all have a good night.
You too. Good night.
Yeah. Now, Lawrence.
Night, night.
Boy, Jim left in a hurry. He must not have had supper.
I'll see you there.
Okay.
Bye.